again. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Good to see you. And I hope we have a good series looking at the Celtic way. We begin this evening with a new journey begins. Next week, early Irish spiritual consciousness. Then we look at some of the characters, some of the personalities. Will the real Patrick please stand up? Bridget, or solidarity with the poor, women and the struggle for equality, and then Colm Kill, and finally Colm Bannis, Ireland's first European and cosmopolitan. I hope we'll learn something together from these people and from this way that existed on this island many centuries ago and which has never quite gone away completely. So a new journey begins. The sacred pushes deeper into Irish soil. We will, of course, have an opportunity for group discussion after the first input, and then after the second part of the input, we'll have a plenary conversation and discussion together. Now, whether or not we can really talk about Celtic Ireland or a Celtic church or a Celtic way is an open question. Celtic identity was invented around 1707, and it became a popular descriptor in the 19th century when there were great debates going on about cultural nationalism and scientific racism. The legacy of those 19th century imagined communities were both thin and sometimes dangerous. Celtic was made up, and its early use was in the context of nationalism and scientific racism. And behind all of that was nationalistic superiority, ethno-racial superiority, and white supremacism. Even violence lurks in our imagined identities and the stories we tell ourselves. So, aware of this very modern history of Celtic, we may prefer to speak of an Irish way rather than a Celtic way, or maybe with sufficient critical awareness, we may still want to use Celtic as shorthand for the culture and the spirituality that is deeply rooted in Irish, Scottish, Welsh, Northumbrian, Cornish, and Breton landscapes and identities. The first people, nomadic hunters, arrived in Ireland around 10,000 years ago. The earliest settlement thought to be Mount Sandal in Coleraine, also Rathlin Island, and in County Mayo. Prehistory remains in the far distant mists of time. Mythological people populated Ireland before we arrive at some truly human population. Noah, from the Bible story, is even said to be an early arrival in Ireland. When you stand close to the Céide Fields, a very early settlement in County Mayo, you look across the bay to Downpatrick Head, and there in the different layers of rocks, you see millions of years of geological history. Like those awesome layers, Ireland's population is also multi-layered. There is no pure Irish race, or pure any race for that matter. We have no monochrome ethnicity or racial purity or ethnocultural homogeneity. We're a hybrid people, among whom the term native may be a misnomer. Immigration we have always had and still have. Even back in the Iron Age, there was a genetically mixed era. Historian Marianne Elliott asserts that prehistoric Ireland was a considerable racial mix. So like the neighbouring island, in many countries in the world, we are hybrid people, even though 19th and 20th century Irishness imagined, and it was imagination, and exclusive and excluding Celtic identity, with serious consequences for modern Irish history and lives and relationships. We are still working through the consequences. We're still trying perhaps to rid ourselves of an ideological Celtic myth, especially of racial purity. And not everyone sees a need for that. What is the far right placard or poster that we saw in Dublin in the riots just before Christmas? What is that poster really saying? With Irish lives matter. The hybrid people who lived in this island with a population of not much more than between 250,000 and 500,000 people lived along the coasts, the rivers, the lake shores, and the uplands. They were never invaded by the Romans, who spent centuries on the neighbouring island. There were Roman influences on Roman coins which have been discovered in Ireland, but Ireland did not have the centralised administrative system that Roman Britain did. Ireland had a decentralised political system with 100 to 150 tuatha, or sub-kingdoms. Ireland did not have a geopolitical centre, but two locations did take on importance: Tara and Cashel. The idea of a high king or an ordree has no basis, I suppose, in history. The nearest Ireland got to a single powerful kingship was in 1002 with Brian Boru. And even if that was established then, a single ordree only lasted until 1172, when the Plantagenets or Normans arrived in Ireland, imposing political and religious order and centralisation. The pre-Christian Ireland was religious. There were old myths and legends which were first written down by the Christian monks, but they long predate Christianity in Ireland. It was a very long journey from the oak grove to communion with Christ. There were many impulses and symbols in the pre-Christian religion and spirituality that found echoes in Christianity. There are gods and goddesses, and the goddess Danu was worshipped and is reflected in the names of rivers, not just maybe here, but the Danube. Mountains also carry the names such as the two Paps of Anu in County Kerry, and an early name for Ireland was the land of Anu. In pre-Christian Ireland, people lived in a sacral world of gods, spirits, and the supernatural. The rhythm of the four seasons was a spiritual rhythm, with festivals for spring, summer, autumn, and winter. The other world intersected with this world. In the Irish myths and legends, we meet two worlds with no demarcation. It was into this spiritual and ethical climate that Christianity took root. The sacred pushed deeper into Irish soil, and the new faith was not so new and not so strange. So let's see how the Christ story came to Ireland. It's not known when Christianity actually came to Ireland exactly. The exact origins are in scholarly dispute, and there is much speculation. Patrick is usually described as the Apostle of Ireland, but we've got to allow for a little bit of Irish exaggeration here, perhaps power politics at work. We'll be looking more closely at Patrick on another evening. But enough for now to say that the traditional date for Patrick's arrival in Ireland, 432, has no historical basis. A case has been made for the beginning of Patrick's ministry in Ireland in 493. But the one date we do have with historical basis is 431, when, according to Prosper of Aquitaine, a chronicler, he wrote, Pope Celestine sent Palladius as bishop to the Irish who believe in Christ. Pope Celestine sent Palladius as bishop to the Irish who believe in Christ. Even if Patrick did arrive in 432, there was already a Christian community in Ireland, enough to warrant a bishop. Indeed, the Bishop Palladius may have been sent to deal with the teachings of a Pelagius, an Irish or Welsh lay theologian whose teachings had caused concern to the Pope and had already provoked action towards the Church in Britain. Was Pelagian theology, or the theology of Pelagius, already in Ireland, perhaps even 50 years before Patrick began his ministry? If Patrick was not the first to bring the faith to Ireland, how did it get here? Possibly three routes. Christian slaves from Britain were a likely early source. Slave trade was a vital part of the economy, and raiding parties operated in both directions across the Irish Sea. Patrick himself first came to Ireland as a 16-year-old slave after being captured by an Irish raiding party. The Christian faith had arrived in Britain somewhere between 250 and 260 CE. And three British bishops are recorded as being present at the Council of Arles in 313. So it's probable that some of the slaves brought to Ireland were the first to introduce the Christian story. From early times, Ireland has had extensive trading routes to and from Europe and even North Africa. West Cork was a recipient of a lucrative wine trade, and at Navan Fort in Armagh, a find dated in the 1st century included the skull of a Barbary ape. How did a Barbary ape get to Armagh in the 1st century? Well, when the faith story was born in Jerusalem, there was something going on between Africa and Armagh. And in the 1st century, the faith story did travel, as we know from the New Testament, from its first location to Europe, along those Roman trading routes and with Christian traders. And the same channel was undoubtedly open to Ireland. Now, there's nothing new about the refugee or immigrant narrative. People have always been on the move, forced by circumstances to flee one location for another. We see much of it in our own time. But it was true of these early centuries as well. Refugees fleeing from persecution and oppression are not new. It was the cause of a population movement from Gaul in the 4th and 5th centuries. Now, Christian faith had taken root in Gaul in the 2nd century, and in Leon there were martyrs by 177 CE. Gaul was represented by 14 bishops at that Council of Arles in 313. The region was invaded at the beginning of the 5th century, creating a whole movement of refugees. Across the Channel was one route, and it may be that refugees in boats sailed on past Cornwall and found their way to Ireland. With them, they would have brought their faith. So by these informal means, slaves, trading routes, refugees, the Jesus story probably arrived in Ireland long before any formal missionary strategy by popes or campaigns to eliminate Pelagian heresy already here. Christianity did not begin in Ireland as a monastic movement or a monastic initiative. That came later. Its beginnings were not even with Patrick. Even then, with Patrick, it was still not monastic. Christianity came to Ireland, in all probability, as an informal lay movement. And Christianity coming to Ireland as an informal lay movement, that may be worth remembering. So let's take a look before we go to groups at the Egyptian desert foundations of this monastic movement that eventually took root in Ireland. The roots of Irish monasticism are in Egypt. Now, there are clues in our storytelling and in the physical landscape. The story has it that some of the earliest Christian foundations in Ireland were in County Antrim, and that they had an Egyptian connection. There is even an Egyptian Coptic connection associated with the town of Ballymena, that a Coptic monk called Mina was responsible for the foundation of Ballymena. Well, believe that if you will, but in fact, it's not a piece of Irish storytelling, but it's a piece of Egyptian storytelling told by a Coptic monk in fairly recent years to an Irish visitor to Egypt. But more compelling is evidence of the High Cross at Moon in County Kildare. It is the second tallest high cross in Ireland, and its site was probably a Columban monastery. Like many high crosses, its panels depict biblical stories, stories from the Hebrew Bible on one side and stories from the Christian Testament on the other side. One of the stories on the Moon Cross is from the Gospels, the feeding of the crowd with the small boys, loaves, and fishes. Now, what is truly fascinating is that the fish depicted on the Moon Cross are not fish found in the seas around Ireland, but fish found only in the River Nile. How did an Irish sculptor in the 9th and 10th century know of Egyptian fish? It suggests, I suppose, some Egyptian connection. The Egyptian desert foundation of Irish monasticism, it lives on in many Irish place names. There are many deserts in our place name, and perhaps the best known is Desert Martin. Well, there's a double connection there. Not only desert, but Martin. And this is Martin of Tours, who was deeply influenced by the Egyptian monastic movement, which began in the desert. Martin was so impressed by what he saw that he brought the model of faith and practice back to Tours and introduced it. Ninian of Whithorn in Scotland studied under Martin in Tours and brought the monastic model back to Galloway in Scotland. It was in Whithorn that the founders of the Northern Irish monasticism were trained, people like Enda of Arran, Owen of Ardstraw, and Finian of Maville. And so this monastic movement, with its roots in Egyptian monasticism, became the model for the Irish Celtic Church. Ireland had no deserts, lots of bogland, but no deserts. But it did have wild, isolated offshore islands like Skellig Michael, off Kerry, out on the Atlantic coast. And monks took to the Skelligs. Towards the end of the 3rd century, Anthony went off into the deserts of Egypt and lived in isolation there for 20 years. Many followed him, and soon there was no isolation. And around 305 CE, Anthony came out of his isolation. Maybe he had no option, but he came out of isolation to teach and direct life in the community. And by the time he died, he had founded 9 monasteries for men and 2 convents for women. A monastic movement was spreading. This was more now than seeking solitude, though solitude was important. It was about recovering authentic spirituality at a time when faith was becoming nominal, and more to the point, faith was becoming bound up with political power and losing its critical or prophetic edge. Egyptian monasticism grew as Christendom took root. In 313, Constantine passed the Edict of Milan, which made the Christian faith respectable, began the process of wedding state and church, and the beginning of the corruption of faith by power. The monastic movement was a resistance movement, a protest movement. Monasticism in its origins was prophetic, a critical embodiment of faith. In a world where faith was becoming mixed with wealth and militarism and political power and violence, monasticism protested, resisted, and by its style of being alternative community, embodied and pointed to the empire of God. Monasticism was truly radical. This was the tradition that travelled from Egypt to Gaul, from Gaul to Scotland, and from Scotland to Ireland. The Irish monastic tradition had desert foundations. Well, that's enough for the moment. Loreto will allocate us into rooms. There are one or two questions that you may want to pick up. You may have questions of your own that you'd rather discuss. That's fine. But one might be, Ireland always had a spirituality and a religious sense. Did this make it easier for Christianity to take root in Ireland? And those three possible ways by which Christianity came to Ireland was a lay movement. Is there anything significant in that for the time in which we live? And that early Irish expression of church was an Egyptian influenced monastic or radical community model. And is there anything to learn from that? Okay, we can take what? 20 minutes, Loreto? So let's go on and look at the monastic or the community model of faith that became part of our Irish experience. Again, we know very little about the church that Patrick founded. I said founded. I got that word into my head. The church that Patrick founded or nurtured during his time in Ireland. There's very little information, but he would have been familiar with the diocesan model developed in Britain from the Roman administrative model. The Roman influence, as we said before, and structure did not impinge on Ireland with its decentralized political model. But in the 6th and the 7th centuries, monasteries began to develop in Ireland, and they became the centres of Christian life and of the church. The early Irish church, we might say, developed in a unique way, and the monastic or community model was more suited to Ireland's rural and decentralised socio-political life. And so the Egyptian monastic model took root. Now, these monasteries were characterised by study and prayer and work. Every monastery had a scriptorium where manuscripts were copied, including those Irish myths and legends. The monasteries were open communities interacting with local people. They were, if you like, community centres, providing education for children and engaging with the rural community. Some, like Clonard and Moville and Glendalough and Bangor, were the early universities of Ireland, great centres of learning. They were also great centres of prayer and worship, including, or producing rather, liturgical books, such as the Bangor Lectionary, which is still preserved in the Ambrosian Library in Milan, and the Stowe Missal. Now, both of those books make it clear that Eucharist was central to monastery life and worship, and a significant celebration in Irish Christianity. Biblical scholarship and deep exegetical work on biblical texts was important, and there was a prodigious output in terms of hymns and prayers and poems, martyrologies, sermons, liturgical material, hagiography or lives of saints, voyage and vision tales, Latin grammars, and scientific treatises. The key person in the Irish or Celtic Church was not the bishop, but the abbot, and in centres like Kildare, the abbess, namely Bridget. Travel, even exile for the sake of Christ, characterised the monasteries, with monks like Columbanus and 12 other monks leaving Bangor for mainland Europe, and Columkill or Columba leaving Derry for Iona. Now, these monks left a huge legacy in Europe and in Scotland and in the north of England. There is some truth in Ireland as a land of saints and scholars, though I suppose we like to tell a good story without sometimes letting the truth get in the way. But the Christian faith pushed deep into Irish soil. It travelled to Britain, to mainland Europe, as far as Kiev, and out over the ocean to Iceland. Even allowing for exaggeration, there is quite a story to tell and to draw inspiration from, even in a 21st Ireland where institutional Christianity is in some kind of crisis and decline. There is a danger of nostalgia, but we need not fall into that trap, but critically look at Ireland's early faith community and faith expression and begin to shape new ways of living and doing faith in the contemporary world and global and the contemporary Ireland and global world. Now, this monastic model lasted until the 12th century. It wasn't always a heroic story. Power is always present, and power can corrupt. And by the 8th century, there is a new title in use. They're talking in Ireland now about royal abbot. That, I suppose, reflects abuses of power, as some monasteries became rich and were caught up in the dynastic struggles of warrior aristocracies. Monasteries were caught up in violence, and Clonmacnoise and Glendalough and Armagh and Kildare were regularly attacked and burned. Tribal violence and dynastic power struggles almost destroyed Christianity in Ireland from the 10th century. Reform was needed, and reform movements did appear. The Culdees from 750 to 900 CE were such a movement, originating in Tala, Dublin. Culdees meaning serving companions of God. They brought renewal to spirituality and living, reintroducing choral music and care for the sick and the poor and travellers. The Eucharist became central again. But then the renewal movement ran up against a traumatic event, the coming of the Vikings. By the time the Vikings had done their destructive work, but also built Ireland's first towns and urban areas, assimilate into Irish culture and life, not only was Ireland changed, but the Celtic or Culdees reform was exhausted. Ireland was not the same, and Irish Christianity was also about to change. Perhaps with such socio-political and cultural change, the shape of the church and faith were inevitably going to change. But Irish Christianity was about to move beyond the monastic era. And that brings us to the 20th century Normans and a changing church. The Kelly Day reform was necessary, as reform is always necessary in the life of faith and its institutional expressions. And the Kelly Day reforms were not lost either. In 921, Gothfrith, the king of North Dublin, attacked Armagh. And it is perhaps significant that he did not destroy the prayer houses with their Kelly Day communities, nor did he destroy their houses of the sick and the Kelly Day monastery. A Norse king treated the Kelly Day monastic heart with respect and valued it. By the early 12th century, major church reform was taking place. Reform was being introduced right across medieval Christendom. And it was to have a major impact in Ireland, because by the end of the 12th century, Ireland had lost its independence, as the lordship of the country lay with Plantagenet Norman kings. Pope Gregory asserted his papal authority and introduced what became known as Gregorian reform. He appointed 2 Italian archbishops of Canterbury, Lanfranc and Anselm. The Vikings in Ireland converted to Christianity, and in their newly built towns they established episcopal sees. Their bishops were consecrated by Canterbury, and in 1074, Lanfranc consecrated the first Viking Irish bishop. 6 more consecrations followed, with every Viking Irish bishop swearing canonical allegiance to Canterbury, and so acknowledging Canterbury's primacy over Ireland. Bishops may have been based in their new Viking towns, 4 bishops in Dublin, but Ireland still did not have the Roman-based diocesan system. Bishops needed a defined territory in which to exercise pastoral care, and that was the next area of reform. In 1101, a council was held at Cashel. Now, Cashel was and had been for some time the seat of a king, but now it became the seat of an archbishop. The Bishop of Munster presided over the council, but he was also the papal legate, and so he was presiding with the authority of the Pope. Everything was changing in the Irish Church. 10 years later, another council was held at Rathbrazel in County Tipperary. It set about restructuring Irish episcopacy. In the Celtic system, each little community had a bishop serving under an abbot. Lanfranc complained that there were too many bishops with too little power. Bishops had no jurisdictional power. And so at Rathbrazel, they established territorial dioceses. What the Pope had ruled for England in the 6th century was now to be the model for 12th century Ireland. Ireland was to have 2 ecclesial provinces, Armagh and Cashel, with 12 dioceses each. A key player in this reform was Malachy, the Bishop of Armagh, who had spent time at the great Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux and was much influenced by its great abbot, Bernard. Because of this relationship with Bernard of Clairvaux, Malachy brought to Ireland the continental monastic movements of the Augustinians and the Cistercians. Mellifont became the first Cistercian foundation in Ireland and a centre for reform. The Synod of Kells was held there in 1152, presided over by papal legate John Paparo. The diocesan system was expanded. 2 archbishoprics at Armagh and Cashel, created in 1111 at Rathbrazel, now became 4 archbishoprics, with Dublin and Tuam added. There was now a clearly defined hierarchy, with Armagh given the primacy. And there was also now an island-wide network of episcopal dioceses with fixed sees and boundaries. And these dioceses and boundaries still exist today and are recognisable in the Church of Ireland and the post-Reformation Roman Catholic Church. Indeed, the cathedral churches of the Church of Ireland are still on the sites agreed at the Synod of Kells in 1152. So Ireland is now in line with the continental church, and the Romanization, if you like, of the Irish Church has taken place in the 12th century. The early monastic church was disappearing. More change was to follow after the mid-12th century. Ireland was a volatile place, open to the wider political dynamics of Christendom. Ireland lost its independence and was now to be ruled by kings from elsewhere. Along with England, Ireland was to become part of the Plantagenet Empire, a colony. It's a complex story and very different from a popular ideological version. A deposed Irish king, Diarmaid McMaster, went to Wales to seek Norman help in recovering his throne. He returned with Richard, Earl of Pembroke, otherwise known as Strongbow, regained his power, but threatened the very political independence of Ireland. The Normans who helped Diarmaid, they rather liked this power, and they saw a future in Ireland. Richard married Aoife, Diarmaid's daughter, a marriage less of love and more a love of power. So when Diarmaid died, Richard became king. He had no intention of ever going back to Wales except on holiday, and that might have been high risk. Henry II didn't like these fellow Normans acquiring all this power in Ireland, and he decided he'd better bring them under control. Gerald of Wales, a person of Welsh Norman origins, described the Irish as a filthy people, wallowing in vice, the least instructed in the rudiments of the faith. Pope Adrian IV agreed with Gerald, and in 1155, 3 years after the Synod of Kells, he issued a papal bull, Laudabiliter, giving authority to King Henry II to conquer Ireland, to, quote, proclaim the truths of the Christian religion to a rude and ignorant people, and to root out the growth of vice from the field of the Lord. The Pope sent a gold ring set with emerald as a sign that King Henry was invested with the right to rule Ireland. Under the donation of Constantine in the 4th century, popes had the right to grant islands to monarchs. The papacy and imperialism, church and empire, had been in bed together now for centuries. And so the Pope ordered Henry II to colonize Ireland. Well, Henry wasn't much interested in a religious crusade to Ireland, but he was interested in expanding his power base and his empire, and the empire was still growing. There is no separation of church and state in this world. This is the 12th century, not the 21st. But Henry has lots of concerns and is in no great hurry. He waits for another 16 years before setting sail for Ireland. By 1171, Diarmaid is dead, and Strongbow, a Norman, is now King of Leinster. Norman power in Ireland could get out of hand. Christendom was now outraged at Henry's involvement in the murder of his Archbishop Thomas Becket in December 1170. Papal legates were on their way from Rome to investigate Henry, and Henry had better get to Ireland and implement that papal bull. And so in 1171, Henry arrived off Waterford and was not sure whether to land on Hook Head or Crook Head on either side of the inlet leading to Waterford, but he did say that by hook or by crook he would land and take control of Ireland. And thanks to Henry II, we still have by hook or by crook in our everyday speech. He demanded the submission of the Norman knights, and he took oaths of loyalty from them. He was also concerned about the Irish bishops, and he asked Bishop Christian of Mellifont to preside over a council at Cashel in 1172. The papacy had decided that the religious well-being of Ireland demanded its political subjugation to Norman kings. In the Pope's words, the people of the land should receive you honourably and reverence you as Lord. And that is precisely what happened at Cashel. The Irish bishops, without question, accepted Henry, and Henry's position was validated by the Pope. According to Gerald of Wales, the Irish bishops now made inquiry into the enormous offences and foul lives of the people of that land. It's classic language of all colonization. The locals are barbaric, foul lives, a rude and ignorant people who need the civilizing and Christianizing, same thing, of the superior colonizers. By the end of the 13th century, more than half the bishops in Ireland were not Irish, and not very far into the 14th century, there was no native Irish bishop in Ireland. The Normans gave Ireland a parliament, but it was a colonial parliament, smaller in scale, much smaller in scale from the one in England, and only able to meet when the parliament in England said that it could. And if a Celtic church existed in Ireland, it was now underground. And despite all the structural change, bishops and dioceses and cathedrals, elements of the old faith were still in the soil, bubbling underneath, and never disappearing completely. In a sense, what happened to the Irish Church in the 12th century was the Europeanization of the Irish Church. It now conformed or was shaped in the continental model. That was what reform essentially meant. The 12th century brought the Celtic monastic church to a structural end and was a turning point in the history of Christianity in Ireland. Reform was to take place in Ireland again, and the next reform was to be in the 16th century. Reformation and counter-reformation, each reform defined in opposition to each other, and the introduction of political and religious sectarianism. We have lived with 16th century reforms since, with tragic consequences. And now we are at a watershed, a turning point again, as institutional Christianity in Ireland is in crisis and demise. Maybe it was always going to happen, not only in Ireland, but in the Atlantic Western world. So what next? What of the future? Okay, we've about 15 minutes to have a natter about some of those things. And maybe those last two questions are pertinent enough. What next for Irish Christianity? What of the future? You might want to also consider that the arrival of the Vikings and the Plantagenets changed the shape of Irish Christianity. It brought a monastic Celtic church to a structural end, and to ask, well, how much is Christianity challenged and or changed by external events, by socio-political events?